Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm out for a walk in the sunlight, and I've been listening to Rupert Sheldrake, his presentation called Is the Universe Conscious? And lately I've been spending quite a bit of time listening to physicists, and Brian Greene is the ubiquitous interviewer in many of these, or the moderator. If I remember correctly, he's the author of The Elegant Universe, which I read, very shortly after it was released. Hey! In the late 90s. It's an introduction to string theory, which I found quite fascinating and was certainly seminal in helping me understand, or giving me a sort of foundation to think about identity in a very different way. And that way involves the concept of refreshment. And I'll get into that as we proceed. A couple of brief notes. First of all, thank you to everybody who listens to and supports and shares my recordings. I'm deeply grateful to you. And if you enjoy them, kindly take a moment to like them or share them, or if you want, you can support me on Patreon. I do provide all of my content without advertisement, which means I get far less airplay, but nobody likes to hear the blaring voices of people selling us stuff during times when we're thinking deeply. And also, I want to apologize for any noise that might be in the recordings. It's a little breezy today, and my mic makes a little noise as it brushes against my jacket and so on. So thank you for bearing with me. I have a couple of ideas that I want to pursue today, but before I do, I'll get back to this concept of refreshment. Many of us understand the idea that if you have a strobe light that's going on and off, and you turn it up to a high enough frequency of going on and off, it appears to always be on. And the idea, one of the central ideas to string theory, is that there are no particles. There are these little strings that sort of warble and bounce around at such a high frequency that they present to certain experimental machines and to thought the concept that a particle is there. Of course, underlying quantum mechanics is the concept of the Schrödinger equation by Erwin Schrödinger, which I believe arose sometime in the 20s or 30s, 19. And it puzzled Schrödinger very deeply and troubled him and others, and still does very deeply. And the trope that we hear about it, the Schrödinger's cat trope, that before we open a box with a cat in it, the cat is in a superposition of states because it's not being observed. Now, this is a very complex problem, and I certainly don't intend to solve it here, but many of the popular ideas surrounding this are mostly wrong. It's not so much the fact that an observer interacts with the complex wave state of the universe in some local position causing a collapse. The key feature here is the word cause. This idea has been presented in such a way as to imply things like manifesting. If you just collapse the wave in the right way, everything goes your way, and so on. I think those ideas are childish. What's actually going on is something far more sophisticated. And it doesn't necessarily depend, we don't know really yet what the relationship is between observation or measurement and the collapse, though we have some clues about it, I think. We being the scientific community that actually spends time empirically examining these ideas. But to go back to refreshment, you can see that in our computer monitors, I'm not sure what the actual situation is, but most of them, at least the old CRTs, used to have a refresh rate. And I'm not sure what the mechanism of the sort of modern screens that we see is. But effectively, on a screen, you can draw a single pixel and you can give it values of red, green, and blue, and then you can continue to draw one pixel across horizontally the however many lines we have, 2,374 or whatever. And if you draw the single pixel fast enough, what appears to the eye is a solid, stable image. And this idea turns out to be incredibly profound if we transfer it to physical processes by way of a kind of a game, right? One could imagine that every position in time-space is being refreshed in a similar fashion, such that it goes from the oldest position to the freshest position in each refresh rate phase. And it's happening so quickly and in such a profound way in terms of its dimensionality that the physical universe appears to us to be solid, when in fact most of the time it's not there. You can imagine another model where like a strobe light that keeps speeding up, when the off phase is current, all beings, minds, positions, situations, histories, and futures collapse to unity. And then, in a flash, the on phase happens, and they return to distinction. And in the unity phase, information is shared. And so in a toy model like this, most of the time, everything is not even one, it's unity. Right? And one is the number we use to represent unity, but one requires a background against which it must exist. And so actually we need some Greek symbol or something that means all positions, wave states, and so on are unified. Information is shared, and then poof, the light turns back on, and everything returns to a position slightly different, but very similar to the ones that they last occupied. Now, this is a toy model, but it's a very profound model, because if something like it, or something that resembles it, is true, it explains many features of our experience, particularly our non-ordinary experience, that are otherwise pretty tough to get a grip on. So in this case, with this model, we would imagine that The universe is collapsing to unity and expanding back to distinction, the appearance of separation, at an unimaginable rate of speed that's been increasing since the beginning of the universe. Again, just a toy, but a very useful toy. And there are ways to interact with the toy whereby we might get some experience of both the unity and the unimaginable intelligence that abides in the process. And that intelligence seems to me to be the origin of our own minds and consciousness. Now, Rupert is a brilliant scientist and a very articulate and humane speaker. It's always a joy to listen to him. And he's been, for many years now, the champion of a non-materialistic view of consciousness in the universe. Of course, what do we mean by consciousness? I mean, I think when we use this catch-all term, we should be careful to think more deeply about it. But we mean things like things that are related to words, such as intelligence, awareness, consciousness, experience, transcendence, right? Enlightenment, and so on. We sort of capture these ideas under the single rubric of consciousness, or at least that's my intention. Now, it should be obvious that consciousness is layered, and a bit like an onion, it has infinite layers, and so too the other words that I used, awareness, intelligence. And by intelligence, I don't mean solving problems. I mean insightful, vital perception and awareness. Fundamentally, insight is an experience very different from thinking. Thinking is rather quotidian in how it tends to proceed for most of us, even when we're trying to solve problems. Insight is shocking. When we experience insight, it's accompanied by many different feelings, some of which involve awe, the urge to exclaim, or even swear, right? in the sense of epithets. We are suddenly overwhelmed with a completely new understanding and perspective, or maybe multiple perspectives, where before we only had one. Our language inclines us to this Unitarian expectation. I will see the way, I will see the truth, instead of, there are very few features of nature that are singular in this way, including our own hands. Our minds are certainly not born for this. It's a feature of language and culture that we expect one thing to overwhelm all others. And in insight, sometimes this is true, but it's also true that we can entertain multiple positions of perspective at the same time, even if many of them conflict, and the synergy of those perspectives produces insight and wonder and awe. And in my own experience, it's very important to distinguish between thinking and insight. Insight is a radical reformulation of fundamental primitives in thought, awareness, and consciousness. Many of us have only very rare experience of insight. And when I'm seeking it, it seems native primarily to conversations with passionately curious others. I can have conversations with myself But even if I am doing that or I am writing, I am imagining the inclusion of an audience whose concerns correlate with my own. So one of the important features I want to again highlight is that whatever we might mean by consciousness, there's always a next layer beyond what we may be thinking about or what we are experiencing. So that, for example, if an insect is conscious, and we also use this word sentient, which seems to mean something like aware of the body and the self as a distinct being and capable of imagination, problem solving, and so on. So much of us, of our thought and experiment is concerned with problem solving, which I think is partly natural, but also partly a side effect of the mechanization of the universe that was the result, hello, of the transformation in thought that begins at the origin of the Age of Reason, when suddenly all ideas of metaphysical, supernatural, spiritual, divine, originary beings and intelligences were summarily dismissed. The universe was emptied of being, and the empiricists became fundamentally concerned with the mechanics of things, forces, causes, how situations unfold over time, prediction, and so on. So what I want to make clear is whatever layer of consciousness we may be experiencing as our own, even now as I speak, there are endless layers beyond that. I won't say above because some of them are within us. In fact, it may be that we have access to many, if not most of them, but our habits and circumstances, our social contexts and environments script and limit us to a catastrophic degree, so that much of what we usually experience is tedious and representational. So if there's consciousness in an ant, and I say there's something like it there, though superorganisms such as ants, bees, and wasps certainly are a unique example of how consciousness might be embodied, where the intelligence is primarily distributive rather than local. And yes, these words are troubling: intelligence, consciousness, awareness, what do I mean, and so on. But we can use them in the relatively common way with some degree of safety, I think. So, Sheldrake was at pains to point out that through most of human history, everything was understood to be a being. The earth was a being, the ocean was a being, the mountain was a being. Now, there's a fascinating history here, the history of the cognitive evolution of our species. And I'm not going to chase that topic too much at the moment because I have a couple of goals I want to wander toward. But certainly if the sun is intelligent, conscious, aware, an actual being, it is staggeringly transcendental to what it usually means to be a human being. And we would find, if we looked, a sort of scalar array of beings and intelligences that span the interval between what we would think of as the universal and the particular. The caveat there is that the particular participates in the universal. And so there's this constant intimate relationship between the intelligences that we might understand to inhabit time-space, whether or not they are specifically, particularly embodied. I think we should imagine distributed intelligences that participate directly in all minds and beings in all of time. And of course, these are the ideas that in English have not many reference. One of them is angel, another might be deva or jinn, another might be daemon or demon, demigods, gods and goddesses, and then we have the sort of, along with that we have the idea of the unity. God imagined as the collective, either as the collection of all beings and intelligences in all universes, or their creator separate from them, but having the property of being their progenitor. So whatever we might mean by these terms, we should imagine both a topology, even among any given class of beings, where you have incredibly intelligent and prodigious, geniuses, and then you have sort of the other end of that scale, however we might like to think of that, and we usually think of it as rather mechanical and robotic or unfeeling, insensitive, aware only of the mechanics. And even among that field, there's a topology. There are mountains and valleys. There are people, for example, whose mechanical or mathematical intelligence is so profound that they themselves become prodigies. All right. So I want us to always think about topologies when we think about any topic or subject or particular feature of experience that we have a name for, like a tree. There are probably trees who are nearly impossible to communicate, and there are other trees who can probably directly communicate very freely with humans and other animals. Now, Sheldrake was presenting an argument that posited a kind of a bipolar situation between empiricists and panpsychists. The panpsychists being the people who think everything is conscious, all different kinds. It's a big symphony of consciousness. That consciousness is reflected in us and also participated in by us. And the materialist empiricists, who think consciousness is something we need to explain away and get rid of, doesn't really do anything, not testable. The universe is a mechanical accident. Now it turns out, the first topic that I want to touch on here is that, and there's some delicate terrain to traverse, these styles of thought, these philosophical positions, And there's certainly not two, right? There's a jungle of different panpsychist perspectives and a similar jungle of empiricist or materialist perspectives. But to make things easy, we'll collect them all together and make a generalization. And what I want to talk about is that usually when we have conversations like this, it's common to ask each other what we believe, what we think is true, and why we think so, and so on. But that's not the best game for lots of reasons, though it's very useful when we choose to engage in it. It can be very useful if the participants are curious and insightful and passionate and complex. The problem is that obviously we're very concerned in our thinking with what is true. And so when we use the word belief, we curate our own position on truthfulness. These are the things that I think are real and good and true. The rest of that stuff over there is probably nonsense or should be dismissed. Now, this turns out to be problematical for a number of reasons. Belief itself turns out to be quite a trouble spot for humans. And the reason it's a trouble spot can be stated very simply. When we become so biased in our thinking that we feel that we've looked at all the questions, come to a perspective that we trust and believe, then effectively our mind collapses into our beliefs. And we become either unwilling or certainly handicapped in entertaining other perspectives. Now, nobody has the final truth. And if there's a person called Nobody, maybe we could talk with them and find out what that final truth is. We're all in the position of learning, and the scope of what we can learn is certainly not merely infinite, it's a library of multidimensional infinities. So our learning capacities are not limited until we begin to believe things. And the picture I want to present here is the analogy of clothing. You can imagine someone who believes that they are their clothing. And this is the problem with belief. It subsumes our intelligence, our curiosity, our imagination, our creativity, and then presents a finished product. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that we should eschew belief, but we should be very cautious about it, because you don't want to exchange the clothing for the being inside. That would be a catastrophic loss of liberty. Yet this is what we are trained to do, particularly in argument. And for myself, I'm very grateful to live in a world where there are empiricists and materialists and even people who feel urgently motivated to dismiss consciousness as an epiphenomena of metabolism, something to be, effectively thrown away, gotten rid of, ignored. The problem with that argument is it should be obvious to everyone, but it rarely is. If it is one's goal to say that thought or consciousness, intelligence, imagination, creativity, any of these features of our experience that we have words for, however incomplete those words or confused they may be, if it's one's goal to say, get rid of all of that, that's meaningless drivel. The only thing that matters is mechanisms and mathematics and empirically testable theories. Okay, the problem is that empiricism, mathematics, and physically testable theories emerge and acquire meaning in consciousness and imagination, in creativity and goal-seeking behavior, in relation with the entire history of life on Earth and all human minds. So if you're going to stand up and say, well, that's just a bunch of nonsense, the problem you have is that you no longer have any legs to stand on because there's nothing meaningful to be said. In fact, there's no more meaning. There's just the mechanics of some situation or some theory or the math, right? But the math is meaningless without consciousness. And the goal of trying to convince people that consciousness is a trivial side effect of metabolism or whatever the theory might be is only useful if there's consciousness, if there's awareness, if there's thought. So these positions, it seems to me, have a fundamental flaw that they very quickly work hard to dismiss. I'm in a lot of wind right now, so I'm going to pause here. So let's just go over this one more time. If it's our goal to say that consciousness and human intelligence and creativity and imagination are meaningless, don't do anything, untestable, so on. Certainly they're not untestable, but they're also not particularly suited to empirical examination, even though empirical examinations can happen. Rupert Sheldrake has very courageously set off in this direction with his theory of morphic resonance, which I'm not capable of stating clearly, but effectively it seems to be his position that minds are non-local. This is also my position. I think of them a little bit like the way physics describes particles, in that it's mostly wave, and the appearance of a particle is really a matter of a perspective in time-space. We're taking a slice of a wave. Now, I'm not saying it's only wave-like. I'm in danger of losing my point here, though. If we're going to dismiss consciousness, or even free will, then all arguments die there. There's no more reason to make arguments. Because if we're not trying to influence each other, first of all, there's nothing meaningful to curate a position to. And so it strikes me as ironic when people try to dismiss the nature and essence of consciousness, intelligence, creativity, imagination, and so on. We can just imagine I'm sentience, right? All these things. Because if they succeed, there's no reason to speak. There's no one to speak to. If there's no free will, why would we talk about that? We're just playing out a pre-arranged, programmatic situation. So, it seems to me that arguments of this nature fail to take into account many important ideas, one of them being incompleteness. And the humans, or some cohort among the humans at certain times, seems to be rabidly hungry to get rid of anything that isn't obviously, blatantly physical. Of course, quantum mechanics presents a serious problem here, because whatever the nature of the physicality of the universe at the scale of the incredibly minute, it's certainly nothing like the physicality familiar to our direct experience. For example, at the macro scale, there seems to be very clearly an arrow of time. And at the quantum scale, this is not at all clear that there's such an arrow at all. And what actually obtains there is very difficult for us to conceive of, though I think we will continue to make progress in our attempts to do so. So the physicalists and the materialists and the empiricists, that those of them who wish to do away with consciousness, with the little asterisk, all those other words, intelligence, awareness, so on, they're missing the fact that if they're correct in the structure of their arguments, right, within the scope of their arguments, if they're correct, there's no one to convince, because there aren't really anything like minds. And it seems very obvious to me, physically and emotionally obvious, that there are minds. But my point is a little stranger here. Throughout the history of the development of human consciousness and cognition, there are these features of the landscape that I call thrisps, and they're essentially very contagious ideas. And the ideas vie in the human cognitium, the network of human minds, and certainly in the wider cognitia beyond that, because the human cognitium participates in vast libraries of other cognitia directly, physically, largely by decimating them. These domineering ideas effectively attempt to replace the mind with a costume, a theory. And what I want to make absolutely clear here is that minds must prevail over theories and beliefs. Theories, models, beliefs, religions, sciences, these are hypostases produced by the mind the way that the daylight is produced by the sun. Nothing that the sun reflects off of here on Earth changes the nature of the sun. There may be relational interchange between the sun and all it reflects on, or all it shines upon, so that the sun very probably is learning and questing and has a purposive element to its essential being. But the fact that it's reflecting off water does not change what the sun is, its nature. If indeed it is possible to say anything about what the sun is, since without the sun around here, you have nothing. No minds, no ideas, no competition, no religion, no science, no nothing. Now, that's not entirely true. You have time-space, but you won't have a living world like this one. Though it may well be that time-space is populated, it just may not be populated by physical entities or locally embodied entities. So the feature I want to highlight here is the essential liberty that must be preserved for our experience of minds to remain vital and malleable, progressive, capable of growth, wonder, awe, love, deep relation, and so on. Over probably the past couple thousand years of the evolution of human consciousness, this has been collapsing. We've been losing degrees of liberty and have confused the clothing of theories and ideas with our minds themselves, so that we collapse our minds into these theories, models, and ideas, religions. And all of them are religions, even if they're not religious. They have the same essential feature of the mind collapses into a system of beliefs, thereby essentially ejecting many, if not most, of its natural degrees of liberty. And I would argue those degrees are ordinarily infinite. Now, infinite degrees of liberty can be a little confusing, so too can the problems of ambiguity, vigilance, and prediction that arise when we're not clinging directly to a relatively solid structure of some array of beliefs or models, so on. So you can understand that there's an incentive here to get rid of ambiguity, and the best way to do that is to have a belief that collapses your concern, awareness, and consciousness into a structured thing that you're capable of speaking in language. Hopefully you can see how dangerous that is, but you should also see how incredibly gravitic to consciousness it is, because much of the history of humans over the past couple thousand years at least, particularly in the past 500 or so, has been oriented toward these three roots of having a mind. Vigilance, what we have to pay attention to and why, and that has at least two poles, more than two, it has like 7 or more. But the two primary poles are opportunity and threat. Ambiguity, which is how we deal with the unknown or the unknowable, particularly the future. And prediction, the ability to form in our imaginations a sense or a perspective that allows us to prepare for and evade problems that might happen in the future. The simplest of these is when I get a knife out of a drawer, I change my mindset to become extremely aware of the edge and its orientation to my body. And this is a vigilance process that deals with the ambiguity of injury and helps me adjust my behavior to hopefully avoid that potential outcome effectively. Now, if I'm distracted because I'm thinking about, how am I going to pay the rent this month, or whatever I'm thinking about, that introduces a load, and you can see that my vigilance has split off so that now I'm thinking about the future and money instead of the knife in my hand. And under these kinds of circumstances, bad things often happen. Now, of course, I'll just mention briefly that at the broad scale of humans as a species or as collectives, countries and civilizations and societies and so on, these faculties are highly disorganized, and they're mostly driven by thrisps, models, processes that have captured the humans and effectively run them. And I've spoken of this in many of my other videos. All right. So we can see that we have these problems where we collapse, even personally. I do this, even though I'm aware of it. We collapse our potential for learning, intelligence, behavior that's mutually beneficial, and so on, into beliefs, models, systems, habits. And mostly these are very limiting, though there are habits that introduce liberty, that by constraining 2 or 3 features of our behavior or thought, introduce liberty rather than deprive us of it. So for example, obviously I have more liberty if my body is healthy. Exercise is a constraint. I will do a specific behavior for a specific amount of time, as I am walking right now, in order to enjoy more liberty over the field of my life, right? Hopefully. Yeah. All of these are guessing games, they're probability games, they're bets. I could easily, something terrible could happen to me on the way to the gym, so that by trying to exercise I end up dead. These are probabilistic games, and you can see how vigilance, ambiguity, and prediction are integrally woven in to these features of our thought and behavior. So let's agree together not to collapse our minds into language, concepts, religions, theories, and structures, but to allow our minds to pervade over them, so that our minds themselves are free. We can easily entertain any of those suppositions without significant loss of liberty. And if we're very skillful, we can actually add liberty to our capacity to imagineer, to solve problems, to understand. And that's one of the words that really belongs with consciousness, understanding. Because this might be the fundamental feature, or a fundamental feature, that is pervasive and I left out of my earlier discussion. So we can actually become aware of the ways in which a specific idea or theory or religion deprive us of degrees of liberty, and intentionally reintroduce liberty to thought and imagination, awareness, as we are entertaining them. I often liken the mind to a bubble of many bubbles, a many-bubbled bubble. And what most of the adults do is they throw those bubbles away, they pop them one by one, and what remains of the bubbles are the intersections, the sticks. Now, children are capable of they can see the sticks, but they don't have to collapse the bubbles to see the intersections. And it's these intersections in the manifold of consciousness that become for us thoughts, theories, ideas, models, religions, mathematics, and so on. So you can see that it's possible to see the intersections without throwing the bubbles away. But what most of us are trained to do is collapse all the bubbles until we just get 1 or 2 sticks remaining, and then we feel that we've had some kind of validatable understanding of whatever we're speaking about or thinking about. The real magic is in maintaining the manifold. And we should be like children in this regard, very concerned about the loss of bubbles, but fully capable of seeing the intersections that become understanding or thought or speech. you can see that I'm doing something like this right now. I'm taking the manifold of all the bubbles of anything I could say, and I'm collapsing them down until there's a certain path or route inside the manifold, and from that I'm producing face noises for us. So I'm doing that, but at the same time I'm trying to play the game more like a child or an artist, where I keep introducing new bubbles to keep the manifold from collapsing all the way down to a belief. Even though if I have a belief here, it might be something like, it's very dangerous to collapse the mind into its products. And beliefs and theories and models, while very useful and sometimes profound, are also a trap if we place them above the mind, so to speak, so that the mind can only now function in the collapsed state that appears to be understanding. It has the presentation face of understanding, but is actually something very different. It is I can't find the word. Perhaps the word will come to me. As if words travel. It is fundamentalism, extremism, right? Ideological extremism. Religion. And by religion I don't mean stuff about God. I mean beliefs held so firmly that the mind collapses into them. And then there's the goal of evangelizing them. So if I have a belief that I'm talking about here, it's that we should not confuse the clothing that we may put on in our mind for our mind. Our mind should always should prevail above all ideas, theories, models, and then it can usefully play in the field of them without being enslaved by them. And this would also cause us to stop trying to enslave others with them. Empiricism is very useful, but it's also the source of many dangers. If we don't believe that being in consciousness, intelligence, and awareness is pervasive in time-space and is the shared resource of all beings and creatures, then we're inclined to treat beings and creatures as if they're machines, and we can't imagine that there would be any consequence. The problem is that even empirically, if the creatures are just mechanical, the way that they're mechanical creates the possibility of life on Earth and sustains that possibility moment to moment. It creates the possibility of human minds who have arguments like this and sustains it moment to moment. So if you tear that down and make 1 trillion products and machines, our minds will die, our world will die. Mechanically, right? Whether there are beings or not, whether the universe is fundamentally supra-intelligent or not. So in game theoretical terms, that's a self-ending move, right? That move in modernity rapidly deprives us not merely of liberty, but of the thing it's supposed to provide, which is survival. And there's no need to decide that either it's empirical or it's panpsychic. We can have both those positions and 17 others, and certainly we're better off if we have access to many positions from which to see, think, feel, understand, instead of one. So my belief is that we should not confuse the clothing with the wearer. Thoughts, ideas, theories, beliefs are clothing for the mind. We may still hold to some because we feel them to be powerful and true and important. But we must retain the liberty to think beyond them, to see beyond them, or to continue to reach, not just for their validation or verification, but for the direct experiences of them. In our daily lives, in our learning behavior, in our practices, as we grope in this human darkness towards something resembling origin, true meaning, love, understanding, and awareness. Now, I have a second topic that I was hoping to introduce, and it's related. I mean, all the topics are related, especially if we're talking about consciousness. We are trained to think that beings, humans, animals, and so on, have essentially static qualities that are entirely local to them. The conceptual background, the syntactic background, the grammars of English, and the metaphors embedded in English script us to think this way. If we're aware of this, we don't want to resist that scripting, we want to surpass it. If we resist it, we become very involved with it in a way that's likely to lead to trouble. But if we surpass it, then we have the liberty to truly develop awareness and understanding, insight, and so on. It turns out that in actual experience, unless someone is simply isolated in a box, which hopefully very few of us are, but some of us actually are, that we call each other into being. And so, if I meet someone on my walk, even just for a moment, there's a not so subtle but easily overlooked situation where we negotiate together what the between of us is like, what the synergistic elements are like, what we will become together even in a single moment of interaction. And so this idea of a separate self really doesn't exist. There are no separate selves, and there's a game that every kind of intelligence recognizes. And you can see this game implemented, a representation of this game is implemented in human technologies. When you attempt to log into a website, there's a negotiation phase where you provide credentials to say who you are. And this is a collapsed structural representation of something that goes on every time beings meet. And they are always meeting. Even in our minds, we maintain a kind of simulation of our relational environment, our social environment, our financial situation, legal situations, all these things, yes? And so the problem is that when we're alone, the representations gain such furious gravity that our minds collapse into them and we become terrified and maybe disembodied, or at least very nervous and anxious and uncomfortable. because you can't live in a representation. There's no life in there. It's dead inside. That's one of the reasons why, in many religions, representations are taboo. Don't make representations. Why not? Well, because they're dead inside. Do you want to become dead inside? Probably not. So do something other than make representations, particularly of the origin world, what we sometimes might call the divine beings and situation in time, space, or in nature. So there's a handshake process that goes on, and every form of life understands this process because it's essential to living beings. There's a kind of self and other awareness, and there's also a benefit-deficit awareness, right, that could be collapsed down to good and bad. Oh, this is a good situation. Oh, this is a bad situation. And this is part of how organisms develop intelligences that allow them to evade danger and to take advantage of opportunities. The other night in a conversation with a friend, I was discussing this principle. We were discussing this principle. And we were talking about the unique ways in which we tend to negotiate when meeting, for example, strangers or people in a parking lot or at the ocean or a restaurant or so on. And my friend has a very playful and magical and maybe slightly mischievous approach. And I do too, although probably more playful and heartful than mischievous. But I was trying to illustrate this principle to him because he was speaking about having experienced something that resembles contact with a non-human intelligence. And he described the process of this contact, and the form of that process is familiar to me because I'm aware of what we could call, in very clinical terms, the handshaking protocol. And so I wove a story. I said, imagine there's a world where everyone is always a child, and there are beings in time-space with whom these children communicate. The children think of them as living in the sky. And these beings were always with the children in a kind of lovingly parental way until there was an accident and the door in the sky closed. And thereafter, some of the children occasionally talked to the beings in the sky. But they thought of them as having two different kinds, a good kind and a bad kind. Angels and demons, if you like. And so the children learned, some of them, how to negotiate the contact to ensure that they would relate with the angels, but hopefully not with the demons, and so on. And the children quickly realized that the demons would offer them power. They would say, you have contacted me, congratulations, you're very brilliant, you're the most powerful of the human children, or of the children. What do you want? We'll give you anything you want, right? The kind of 3 wishes situation that is often represented in myths and fairy tales. And of course, everyone wants power and wealth and long life and attention and worship and so on, don't they? But the children quickly learned that the beings in the sky, when contacting them, when those beings presented to the children the possibility of having anything they wanted, that those were usually demons. And so the children learned to resist that gambit, and those children that learned that were the ones who were able to relate with and learn with and grow with and prosper with the angels, the good beings. But the stranger thing here is that maybe there was only one kind of being in the sky. And the answer to the question, what do you want? Especially, do you want power, wealth, long life, freedom from concern, and so on? Do you want comfort? That this question actually changed the polarity of the intelligences in the sky, so that if the children answered, yes, I want power, wealth, etc., that changed the polarity of the relationship toward desire, toward hunger. And so it isn't as though there are two different beings, there's just one, but it transforms depending on how you relate with it. Now, in case you think that this is just a fairy tale, you can see something like this in every relationship that we have with anything, even with the structured representations in modern society and so on. When we approach an animal, for example, a dog, there's a negotiation phase where the dog is trying to determine who we are. Right? So it doesn't overtly ask us who we are, it's sensitive. It smells us and feels the between of us, and it may be in some state before it meets us. It may be frightened or anxious or concerned. That could lead to it growling, even if our intentions are entirely benevolent. Everything in nature understands this handshake game. And if we have the opportunity to interact with non-human intelligences, we should be aware that we are being changed by the interaction, and the intelligences are transforming based on how we relate with them. And the between of us is where the relationship takes place, not in me, as me. And selfishness is everywhere recognized as problematical and dangerous. Benevolence is, it seems, fundamentally associated with the concern for the welfare, growth, liberation, education, progress of all beings. In all of time, but certainly here on Earth, all human beings or all of the organisms of Earth. So it's very easy to tell the difference between someone who wants what a demon has to offer, which is intrinsically selfish in this model, and someone who wants benefit for everyone. And this is part of the handshake. Right? It turns out that the signal of recognition in the myarch, in time-space itself, is the memory of the unity of origin and the presentation of the recognition of the intimate relatedness of all beings. Relatedness is actually the wrong idea, although in the world of separation, this idea will suffice. It's the recognition of fundamental unity, communion of all beings. As if there's just one being in all of time-space, And this being is multi-layered and multi-dimensional and appears as humans or ants or mountains or oceans, living worlds, stars, black holes, time-space, quantum physics, everything. Someone who brings the signal of recognition to a situation that could become very dangerous will often find that it transforms. But this can't be done in a calculated way. It's a dance. We negotiate together. It's not one person does one thing, the other person does another, and so on. But this game is fundamental not just to meeting other beings and non-human intelligences, it's fundamental to all of nature. Every single being in all of nature understands this game. The one who brings the memory of origin invokes communion, and that situation releases us from something that could be competitive or violent into the opportunity of anamnesis, of the recollection and recognition of our fundamentally communal nature. There's much more to be explored here, but I wanted to present just a little bit of some of the thoughts that I had during my conversation. I'm going to pause for the moment, and I may take up this recording again soon. In case I don't, thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon.